This week on Q&A, syndicated radio talk show host and author Thom Hartmann.
Thom Hartmann, a couple of weeks ago, we had Fred Grandy on this program. He's a Republican, conservative, Washington-based, former congressman, on and on. You are Oregon-based, progressive, not a former congressman. What's the difference of how you approach your day on your radio show?
Between me and a conservative congressman?
And doing it from Oregon and doing it from D.C.?
Yeah. You know, I think perhaps even more important than the differences are the similarities. I didn't see that particular show, but I've seen many of your interviews, and I have some very good friends who are conservatives. My father died a Republican as he died a couple of years ago, and as he was dying, I was sitting there with my hand on his shoulder and looked over, and his two favorite pictures were on the wall, me shaking hands with Pope John Paul II and George W. Bush on the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln declaring mission accomplished. What I see in the commonality is that we all love this country, that we all want to make this a better world, that we all want our children to have more opportunity than we had in a better world. And that is kind of the stepping off point for what the differences are between what I'm doing and the fellow that you just described. You know, he's working within the system, and many people do, and I applaud them. I'm not constitutionally made for it. But being a politician, even a Republican politician, I honor. That's a very tough job to do the people's work. But in what I'm doing is, by and large, trying to bring out the largest vision possible, to give people an opportunity to hold a sense of the whole thing rather than the micro units. For example, if I'm talking about health care, I'm ultimately always going to get back to, is it a right or a privilege? You know, the kind of debates that the founders would be having. And in fact, I would say that they had, because during the George Washington administration, they passed legislation to care for the poor, the health care of the poor in Washington, D.C. In fact, it was James Madison's first veto was vetoing a bill to give money to a church to do that. And he said, this shouldn't be done by a church. This is a secular job. So if it was that, there would be that. If it was, you know, our cap and trade or carbon taxes or things, I'd try to take it to the picture of global warming. And even beyond that, I think the whole global warming issue is, there's even a bigger picture there, and that is our understanding of who we are relative to everything else that's alive on this planet, where the planet itself is a living organism.
Let me ask you, who can hear you and see you now?
We're syndicated by, you mean technically, we're syndicated by three companies. Dow Global, which used to be called Jones, syndicates me. They syndicate a number of progressive hosts, as well as some conservatives, Neil Bortz and Clark Howard, who does a kind of a consumer show. That's on commercial radio. I'm syndicated by Pacifica, so we're on radio stations around the country, nonprofit radio stations, plus we cover about an eighth of the UK, and we're in Ghana, in Africa, on Pacifica stations. And then we're syndicated by Free Speech TV on television. The third hour of our radio program, we do like Don Imus used to do, you know, it's kind of radio and TV at the same time. And so we run that through that third hour on Free Speech TV, which is on Dish Network.
What time of day are you on in Oregon when you do the show?
In Oregon, it's 9 to noon Pacific time. It's noon to 3 Eastern time.
How would you say you approach your show different from most others that have one of these radio shows?
I try not to do complaint radio. That is one of the things that, frankly, turns me off when I hear it. I think it's really easy to just complain about the issues or the people or the politicians of the day. I try to be entertaining, informative, and relevant, obviously, but in a way that offers solutions. In fact, I have kind of an internal rule that I've used certainly in writing the books that I have in print and articles and things and speeches and whatnot, but have brought to the radio show, because my writing long preceded my radio show and now TV show. And that is, if it's something my dad used to say. You know, if you can't come up with a solution, don't tell me about the problem. You know, or I'm paraphrasing badly, but you know, there's what are the ways that we can fix these problems? I'm very interested in results. I'm very interested in solutions, but I think that the solutions have to come out of a large understanding, and that's the other thing that concerns me about some of my colleagues on the right and the left, is that they'll take a small issue and blow it up and hammer on it as if that's really what it's all about. And I think that as a culture, my last book, and I don't mean this as a plug. But
no, because we're going to talk about your books.
Okay, well, my last book is the subtitle of it is The Crisis of Western Culture. And the reason we chose that subtitle is because I really think that there is a cultural crisis. The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are relative to each other, relative to our political structures, relative to our corporate structures, relative to our religious institutions, and most importantly, relative to all life on Earth. Many of those stories are very dysfunctional, and we need to change those stories. So rather than just complaining about, you know, so-and-so did bad today, I'd rather, if I'm going to even go there, I'll use that as a stepping off point to talk about the issues.
I've listened to you for years, and one of the things I hear more often than not is your brunch with Bernie.
Yeah.
Let me run a clip when we covered your show where you're talking to Senator Bernie Sanders, and I'll ask you about that.
Sure.
And that's an appropriate role for government, is to protect us from the predators among us.
Well, you know, it's funny. I mean, this logic of Bush and Reagan and these guys carries over to the degree that Bush recently issued some rules that wants to cut children from health insurance programs that are working very well. We have the S-chip program, which is a very successful program, insuring more kids in this country. We've got to insure every kid. What Bush's response is he wants to cut kids because he's afraid this impinges on private insurance companies' ability to make some money off of our children. But this whole role of government in protecting the American people is something that has to be reevaluated, I think.
It really does. We really need to go back to the meme of it's a we society, not a me society. Senator Bernie Sanders with us, the first hour of our program every Friday, taking your calls. Brunch with Bernie, sanders.senate.gov is website. Bernie, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be with you, Tom. Take care.
Always great having you on. It's 57 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann with you on Air America.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Talk radio for the rest of us. This is Air America Radio.
Two questions. Why do you give an hour a week to Bernie Sanders, and why does he do it?
I give it to Bernie because he is willing to take calls from listeners for a full hour, unscreened. I mean, we ask people what their name is, what their city is, and what their topic is, and Sean makes sure that they're not drunk or screaming obscenities. But that's it. I mean, that's, you know, and he has no idea who they are or what's coming. And so here's a member of the United States Senate at the time that was recorded. I think he was in the House of Representatives, who, and we've been doing this on our program for I think 6 years now, every Friday. Who's willing to answer any question. I mean, somebody calls and they want to talk about carbon taxes, or they want to talk about S-chip, or they want to talk about health care, or they want to talk about, you know, 9/11 conspiracies. I mean, Bernie will take any question, and sometimes he'll tell our listeners that he thinks that they're crackpots, and sometimes he'll tell them that he agrees. And he's one of the few politicians that I know who is absolutely willing to just be who he is in all cases. I have so much respect for him. I lived in Vermont for 10 years, and he didn't come on the program because we knew each other, because we didn't. It was the result of a radio station owner in Vermont who was carrying my show, who suggested that I should have him on as a guest, and all this kind of grew out of that. And
why does he come on? Why does he spend a whole hour every Friday?
I think because he believes in his message. The thing that I got living in Vermont was, I remember the first fundraiser. There was a friend of mine knew Bernie, and he ran Hal Coney runs the community action programs in central Vermont, and he said, let's go to a fundraiser for Bernie. It's just down the street, and they're going to have some music and free food or whatever. And I said, oh no, how much is it? And he says, well, the suggested donation is $5. And suggested, right? And so I went down there, and here's this guy who's doing retail politics. And every week, virtually, he's back in the state. And he's knocking on doors and talking to people and listening, actually listening. And in the Northeast Kingdom part of Vermont, which is the northern third of the state, where you see Bush signs in 2000 and 2004, and a lot of gun racks in the backs of pickup trucks and a lot of mobile homes, a lot of poverty, and a very, very, very fundamentalist and conservative area. Bush carried that area in both the 2000 and 2004 elections, well over 70%. Bernie carried it in both elections, 70, 80%. And he calls himself a democratic socialist. But people get it, that he's genuine. He's the real thing.
Is he you?
No, Bernie is working within the political system and while he has the big picture, he's willing to work at the micro level. I'd rather work at the macro level, and I'm in the media.
Let me ask
we
you,
agree on many things.
I've heard you, especially in light of the Supreme Court decision about corporations having the ability to take out, you spend money on ads on behalf of a candidate. What is the difference between that, and you've been critical, but that of having corporations all these years who have owned radio stations, television stations, and have curried favor with politicians or given them what you've given them, a whole hour every week? Yeah. Isn't it the same thing? In-kind contribution?
No, it's a really very different thing. I wrote a book about this in 2000 called Unequal Protection, The Rise of Corporate Dominance and the Theft of Human Rights. And I originally sat down to write a book about Jefferson, because we had bought a house in Vermont, and in the attic was the 20-volume complete set of the writings of Thomas Jefferson. I just sold a business, and we were kind of retired. And so I took a couple of years and I read it. It's only been printed once, 1909, Thomas Jefferson Memorial Association. His diaries, his personal letters, his private notes. I mean, it's just incredible. And in the middle of writing this book about Jefferson, I was kind of taking Jefferson's vision of America up till today, and I kept reading. I had read in so many books that in 1886 the Supreme Court ruled that under the 14th Amendment, because it says no person shall be denied equal protection, there are natural persons, you and me, and there's artificial persons, corporations, governments, churches, and they have to have some personhood status in order to pay taxes, own property, be sued or sue, things like that. And because the 14th Amendment doesn't say natural person, it simply says person, that the court had ruled that therefore corporations had rights under the Bill of Rights. So I went down so at that point I thought I was trying to do everything from original resources. I was, actually reading Jefferson's stuff. And so I went down to the Vermont Supreme Court Law Library, which is a really old one. Vermont was a nation before it joined the United States. Vermont and Texas are the only two that were. And Paul Donovan, the librarian there, found the original published in 1889, decision. And I read it and discovered that in 1886, the Supreme Court actually didn't rule that corporations are persons. In fact, they ruled the opposite. But the clerk of the court, in his headnote, in his commentary, which has no legal standing, opens it by saying corporations are persons under the 14th Amendment and entitled to equal protection under the law. And so then I started digging into, well, who is this clerk of the court? His name was John Chandler Bancroft Davis. And he was formerly the president of the New Bergen, New York Railroad. And this was the railroads were suing. This is Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad was the case. And it was one of the first examples that I could find of major, probably bribery level corruption within and on the Supreme Court. Him and Stephen Field, one of the justices. And in fact, he wrote that headnote after the Chief Justice, Morrison Remick Wade, who he said he was quoting, had died. He died a year after the decision of heart failure. And I think that Chief Justice Wade is rolling over in his grave. So in the intervening years, we've had corporations claim 14th Amendment rights against discrimination. If you can't say no to a black person at the lunch counter at Woolworths, you can't say no to a hog farm in your neighborhood or a Walmart. We've had them claim Fourth Amendment rights of privacy, that we can't tell you about, or Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. We're not going to tell you what we know about tobacco or asbestos and things like this. And now we've had them claim First Amendment rights of free speech. And they tried that in Nike versus Kasky, or Kasky versus Nike in 2002, which came out just after my book was published. And were not successful in as much as the case ultimately just got pulled. It wasn't decided by the Supreme Court. And so the Citizens United case that just happened, the grounding assumption of it was that First Amendment rights are extended to corporations because they're persons just like you and I. And that grounding assumption is based on a misinterpretation of that original Supreme Court case. In fact, in the Kasky versus Nike case, a group of folks wrote the amicus brief on Kasky's side saying, corporations shouldn't have these rights. 100 major American corporations were saying, no, corporations have to have the right to lie, the free speech right. And like we all do, there's no law against saying, no, you don't look fat in that dress. It's no law against it. It's perfect. If you're under oath, maybe, or police officer, but those are exceptions. So what we had noticed was that in an earlier case regarding this stuff, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, where in Massachusetts there was a law that said that corporations couldn't involve themselves in politics unless, in political campaigns, unless the campaign directly impacted the corporation. And the First National Bank of Boston had put money into a political campaign that had nothing to do with banking. And so they were sued by Bellotti, who was the Attorney General. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in that case, the court, that was one of the cases that set the precedent for this case. The court ruled that that corporation actually had the right to speak beyond just its own little narrow area. But in the dissent, Justice Rehnquist, who I always thought of as a kind of conservative curmudgeon, Justice Rehnquist in his dissent said, this is from memory and it's a couple of years old, but I think it's pretty close to a pretty good paraphrase anyway. He said, back in 1886, without the benefit of open debate or discussion, this court ruled that corporations have the rights of natural persons. I think that this court ruled in error in that case, and this is an extension of that error. That's essentially what he said. The first half of that sentence is pretty much verbatim. And he had obviously never read the case. When my book came out, I spoke at a law school. There are several now that use it. And there were about 300 law students and probably 20 or 30 faculty there. And this was in 2002. And I said, everybody who knows that in 1886 in Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, the Supreme Court gave corporations access to the Bill of Rights the same as persons, raise your hand. Everybody in the room raised their hand. They were all wrong. And even Rehnquist believed this. So when the front of the court brief was put together on behalf of Mark Kasky, who was suing Nike, the goal was to make sure that Rehnquist realized that he was right, that he was wrong, that his position was right, that it was a bad decision, but that there hadn't been a decision. And after the briefs were filed, the court did something that it almost never ever does. They came up with a one-sentence line, the writ of certiorari, the decision to hear this case. Now this is after the debates and everything. All this work that the court did was granted improvidentially. We should never have heard this case in the first place. They just said like that. And I think, nobody knows why, but I think it's because Rehnquist read our friend of the court brief and went back and read the case and had one of these moments. And now Rehnquist is gone, and he's been replaced by somebody who thinks that corporations should have rights. That's really what it's about. I'm sorry, you asked me what time it was. I told you how to build a watch.
No, but go back, though, to the original question about the power of a radio station or a television station to be involved deeply in the political contest with no regulation of them whatsoever. Why should they have that kind of power? Or you, as a matter of fact, with your radio program, and a lot of other entities don't have that kind of power, don't have that kind of access.
Sure. They, on an unlimited basis, they shouldn't. No institution on an unlimited basis should have free speech rights. This is where I defer. This is where I agree with the 4 justices who dissented in the Citizens United case that was just decided. I think that whether it's a radio station, a television station, a cable system, a satellite, whatever it may be, that there needs to be, if it's part of the commons, if it's using the public airwaves or it's using the rights of way that are maintained by we the people for, to lay their cable systems and things, there needs to be some accountability to we the people. And so while I'm not in favor of a fairness doctrine where somebody sits and says, okay, one liberal, one conservative, because I don't think that's even possible to calculate. Michael Savage spent most of the last year of the Bush administration trashing George Bush. Does that make him a liberal? But I'm not in favor of that. But I do think that broadcasting in the public interest is a doctrine which held up until really 87, Reagan weakened it, and in 96 with the Telecommunications Act, Clinton kind of blew it up. That's something that we should be really seriously looking at again.
I like to, from time to time, read back your Wikipedia entry, just to see how much of it you agree with. There's a lot here, so we're not going to read the whole thing.
I didn't write a word of it.
Well, I know, but I just wondered, because a lot of people go here when they want to know something about somebody's background. It says you're 59 years old this year?
I will be in May, yeah.
American radio host, author, former psychotherapist?
Yeah. I was rostered in the state of Vermont as a psychotherapist. In 78, my wife and I started a community for abused and severely emotionally disturbed kids in New Hampshire. It's still there, the New England Salem Children's Village, salemchildrensvillage.org, if I could give the plug. And ran that for 5 years, and that was just, it was a slice of my life. I've done a lot of different things.
Was it a business or was it a nonprofit?
It's a nonprofit. We put a fair amount of our own money into it, which we never got back, of course. And we worked there for 5 years at a $25 a week salary. So,
how'd you survive?
Well, we had done well. In 78, we sold an ad agency that I was a partner in, and Louise and I, when we've been married 38 years, I think, something like that. We've been married. I keep forgetting because it changes every year. We decided early on that we didn't want to retire when we got old. We wanted to take our retirement in little pieces throughout our lives. So we've built up and sold off 5 quite successful businesses, and a couple, we had one that failed and one that was And then we'll take a year or two, and we took a year and lived in Germany, for example. I've done international relief work for years in between, and sometimes even when we're running companies. So that was actually kind of a retirement for us. We got out of the business world and decided that we wanted to do something that had a lasting impact, something that was...
Where does that, I know, because I've done some background, where does the word Salem come from?
Salem, the organization that we modeled our program after, at the time in 78 when we started this, the only institution in the United States that was family-based for kids who couldn't make it in foster care was the Menninger program in Topeka. And we knew Carl Menninger, or the program anyway. And the program in Germany was started after World War II by a German who had been a prisoner of war throughout the war, and he started a program originally for widows and orphans and just the people who were just ruined by the war, but it turned into a program for abused kids. And it comes from shalom and salem, the Hebrew and Arabic words for peace. And in fact, the logo, the phrase next to the logo is Salem means peace, or Solemn actually is how it's pronounced.
And the fellow's name?
Gottfried Mueller. He just died last year at the age of 92.
He's important to you.
He was my mentor in so many ways. I wrote actually a book mostly about him. It's called The Prophet's Way. It's got nothing to do with prophecy. There's this path in the forest in Germany that he and I used to walk on. He would walk every day. It's a couple miles around the backside of a mountain. where he would go to pray, and he would yell at the prophet, Jeremiah, where are you when we need, things like that. And so he called it The Prophet's Way. So I named the book after that path in the forest. It's about my relationship with him. I learned a lot from that man.
Did you know him well?
Yes. I met him in '78. We were running this ad agency in Michigan, and a friend of ours who was a vice president at Holiday Inns and was in the same church that I was in, Don Hoy, called me from Germany one day. It was in March of '78, and said, Tom, I'm here in Germany, and I've just seen the most amazing thing, and we need your help, and I want you to be in Nuremberg tomorrow morning. And I was like, Don, I'm a little busy right now. We've got this big job to do for Kellogg's. And he said, no, I've already bought your ticket. You're going to be here. If we, I'm calling in my friendship favors. And so I said, okay, fine. I had a passport. So I hopped on the plane, and the next day I went to Germany, and I saw this program where, no more than 8 kids in a house, a mother and father, house parents, a family model for kids who otherwise would be institutionalized. And it was just amazing. And Mr. Mueller they were starting a program in the United States. And he wanted, now this was in March of '78, it was the International Year of the Child, so it was the perfect year to do it. And he wanted to do, and he had an orchestra of 34 kids who played beautiful music. A retired, famous, Poldi was his name, famous, conductor in Germany, had taken this as his retirement work to build this orchestra. He wanted them to play Kennedy Center, Berkeley Performance Center in Boston, and Lincoln Center in New York in March. And he wanted me to book that for August of the same year. And I just, and I said, you can't do that. He said, you'll be able to do it. You'll make it happen. And I thought, okay. And he wanted our ad agency to promote. I mean, he had said to Don, we need an ad agency that can do this. And so I originally took it on as a job. And I spent the next 4 months putting this thing together. We actually did it. Ted Kennedy got us playing before Congress. Andrew Young's wife was head of the International Year of the Child. Got to know her quite well, Jean Young. In fact, there's a chapter about her in my book about Herr Mueller. And the kids played for the UN. They played at Lincoln Center and Berkeley Performance Center and all this. And when it was all done, Meister Rostropovich and Celeste Holm had thrown a reception for us at the Watergate. And I had flown home for about a week in the middle of this tour because our son was born, our middle child, and we did a home birth, and so I delivered him. And so he was there, a week old, and my wife and me, and we're sitting at the table with Herr Mueller and his wife, and Louise Richards, who started a solemn program in Maryland. And he said, great job, thank you for everything you did. And then he turned to me and just looked me right in the eye. And he said, why don't you sell your business and do something worthwhile with your life? And the project that I had done before I took on his job, for which I never billed him, by the way, was to produce a 25, 30-page booklet for one of the largest cereal companies in America that went out to millions of school children called Sugar, the Essential Nutrient. And I still feel guilty about it. And we were making good money. And, we had the company Volvos and the big house and all that, and it just wasn't making it. And so I turned to my wife and I said, I'd like to do that, And, in fact, I said to him, what would you suggest I do? And he said, why don't you start a program like we're doing? So I turned to Louise and said, what do you think? Because she's always been my partner in all these things and usually ends up running them. And she said, that sounds like a great idea. And so we literally that month sold the business, moved to New Hampshire. Over the next 3 months, bought 136 acres on a 2,000-acre lake, and over the next couple of years built 3 houses, and it's still there and it's still running.
I know you were born in Grand Rapids.
Michigan, yeah.
Name as many as you can the places you've lived in your life.
Well, I was born in Grand Rapids, grew up in Detroit, and then Lansing for most of my life. We left Lansing in '78, moved to New Hampshire to start the Children's Village. Then we moved to Georgia, to Atlanta in '83, and started a wholesale travel business, international wholesale travel. Sold that in '86, moved to Germany for a year. Came back to Atlanta, started an ad agency. Sold that in '97, moved to Vermont, and just wrote books for a while, and then started this radio show in 2003 in Vermont, and then 5 years ago moved to Portland, Oregon. So.
There's this about you in Wikipedia. He received his CH, Chartered Herbalist degree from Dominion Herbal College, an MH, Master of Herbology degree from Emerson College of Herbology, and a PhD in homeopathic medicine from Brandrich
Forest.
is that the way you pronounce it, in England.
Yeah.
Is that your education?
Well, by and large, I don't even claim those. I mean, you won't. One of my books long ago had that in it, and somebody put that on the Wikipedia page. I don't talk about it on the air, and I don't call myself any of those titles. Long before that, I dropped out of 2 colleges, so I present myself as a layperson. One of those was part residential program, but a lot of them were basically, kind of like University of Arizona courses. I did that because in the 70s we ran an herbal tea company, and I was just fascinated by herbology, herbal medicine. Went through a period where I was just really into it. So.
Father, an atheist, mother, a Christian.
Yeah, although I didn't know my father was an atheist until the year that he died.
Why didn't you?
He never told me. He'd dress us up and take us to church, and he'd sit there.
What church?
Mostly Methodist. I grew up mostly in the United Methodist Church. There had been a few others that were just nearby for convenience. Kendon Drive Church of the Nazarene when I was in Lansing for a couple of years. I think he thought it was important for us to have a religious background. My mom was not a fundamentalist, but a passionate. She was spiritual. I mean, rather than religious. She went to church, but she was, and I would say my dad was deeply spiritual. He just framed it in a completely different way. But when he was diagnosed with mesothelioma, which is what killed him, he and I sat down and I said, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think is going to happen when you die? And it wasn't like I was trying to evangelize him or anything. I was just, I wanted to know what my dad thought. And he said, I think the lights are going to go off. And he said, what do you think? And I said, I think that the entire universe is a living organism, and that we're a small expression of its intelligence, and that we came out of the light into this body, and that when I die, I'm going to go back into the light. And I don't know what that means, but that's the best I can do. And he said, well, that would be nice. He said, I guess I'll find out. So,
your mom alive?
No, she died a few months ago.
We have some video of you, I think it's 1998, with the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
Show that and ask you what this occasion is.
2 books I wrote. I thank you. Who you are. As I viewed the world. I was a child of the 60s, as it were, I mean, I was part of the anti-war movement and all that sort of thing. And I've carried from that day until 4 days ago with me the idea that there's them and us in situations where there's clearly identifiable evil. And I only realized it just a couple of days ago when His Holiness was speaking that this was the level of story that I'd been operating at, that institutionalized evil creates a them that we have to oppose. Right? And that's what we had done during the time of the Vietnam War, for example.
What's that? What are we looking at?
Well, 2 things. First of all, just to finish that story, there were 30-some of us who were invited to spend a week with His Holiness the Dalai Lama for what was called the synthesis dialogues, which we spent every morning talking among ourselves, and every afternoon we'd spend 4 or 5 hours sitting with him and conversing about how to create a world that works. And in fact, it's been made into a movie that's narrated by Harrison Ford. It's called Dalai Lama Renaissance. And at one point, there was this huge debate among us, and it wasn't all Americans, but many of us were, about what we could do to help the Dalai Lama free Tibet, and that we should have a boycott, and that we would do this and all this kind of stuff. And there were a few of us who were saying, no, this is, we didn't come here to talk politics. We came here to, for bigger things and spiritual things and whatnot. But ultimately, we decided that we would present to His Holiness our willingness. And between the 30 some odd of us, we had millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of readers and viewers and listeners and whatnot. And so the fellow who was doing the presentation stood up and said, Your Holiness, we're prepared to call for a boycott of Chinese goods until China stops trashing Tibet. And without going through a whole long story about it, just to kind of cut to the chase, he pointed out that outside the Norval Link Institute was a stele, a 700-year-old tower with 4 sides, written in 2 sides in Tibetan and 2 sides in Chinese, and that this was when the Emperor of China and the King of Tibet's son and daughter married. And for all these hundreds of years, maybe it's more than 700 years, for all these years, the Tibetans have been saying that it was basically they were signing a trade deal, and the Chinese have been saying that Tibet agreed to become a state of China. And so A, this isn't something we're going to resolve next week. And B, he said, he asked the fellow this question, and this fellow had been very active in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And he said, could this lead to the death of people? Will this create a crisis in China? He said, my understanding of economics is that if you stop buying things, people will be out of work, they'll be hungry. And the guy said, yeah. He said, people died in South Africa because of the boycotts. And that's the price sometimes you pay for freedom. And His Holiness said, well, there's the problem. He said, if one child dies because of the actions that we take in this room, it's too high a price to pay. And that was the moment for me when that little circle in the sand that I was describing in that clip, the Dalai Lama came along with a whisk broom and just whisked it away and said, sorry, there's no us and them. It's a giant we. We're all in this together.
Why do people consider the Dalai Lama to be holy?
Well, the Buddhists think that he's the reincarnation of the Buddha of compassion. And I don't want to speak for the Buddhists. You get a better description of that. I think that most people around the world think of him as, if not holy, at least worthy of tremendous respect, because he absolutely lives his values. I think the story I just told you is a great example of it. He absolutely lives his values, and has risked his life at times for that, and is an outspoken advocate of peace in the world. The ideals that we all love. Oddly, I felt the same way meeting Pope John Paul II. It was he invited us for a private audience, but it was in the context of a concert at Castle Gandolfo.
This is about a year later from this event?
I think it was a year before.
Year before? It was right in the same time.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, I hadn't, this came out of the blue. It was my book about Herr Mueller. There was a woman who used to work as a volunteer in his programs back in the 50s or 60s, and her husband was one of Karl Wojciech's best friends. And Karl Wojciech, of course, he became Pope John Paul II. And when I wrote the book about Herr Mueller, she shared it. Herr Mueller sent a copy to her. She showed her husband. He said, oh, this is great. We've got to invite this guy to this annual thing that we have where we invite people to, it's an ecumenical, or it's, they bring Protestants and Catholics and people of other religions together to listen to a concert, and then there's about 30 or 40 people who get to have what's called a private audience. It's really a photo op and a few short words with the Pope. And I was sitting about 30 feet away from him through the concert, and behind him was this 9-foot-tall statue of Peter, with the keys to the kingdom and the book, And it suddenly occurred to me that this was a man who, with a dozen or 24 words, could bring war to the planet, and other popes had, or could advance peace. And when I met him, when I actually shook his hand and talked with him, I just got this sense of this very grounded, decent person. And I went back and started reading his writings and things. And, you know, he begged George Bush not to invade Iraq. He tried to intervene in the Carla Faye Tucker case, you know, against her execution. He was a principled and I think very good man. So I think that the world views people like that as holy because we all aspire to be in some way that consistent to our values.
Who do you think, if anybody, convinced you or led you to be a speaker, a writer, and then run a talk show?
I've always wanted to be a writer. My mother was an English major. She graduated from MSU with a degree in English.
Michigan State University.
Michigan State, yeah. She and my father also. They had when he died, there were over 20,000 books in his house. I lived in a library. You know,
20,000.
20,000. The entire basement. It was organized like a library.
What had he done as a profession?
He worked in a tool and die shop. He was when he came back from World War II. He was in the occupation in Japan, and with the GI Bill, he was going to college and he wanted to be a history professor. And then my mom got pregnant with me, which was unplanned. And so he dropped out of school in his second year and went to work in a steel mill in Grand Rapids, which is where he was exposed to the asbestos that ultimately killed him. And but he continued a lifelong passion for learning, as did my mother.
But he worked in a tool and die shop.
Yeah, for 40 years.
For 40 years, and had 20,000 books in his library.
That's right.
And ended up his life as a conservative?
His entire life. Yeah, in 1963, I went door to door with my dad. I was 14 years old. I went, or 64, I was 13 years old. I went door to door with my dad for Barry Goldwater.
Did he, when you would get together with him, would he talk his philosophy and what?
We talked politics all the time, and I think one of the reasons why I enjoy having conservatives on my program, and I do almost every day, and debating them respectfully.
Which, by the way, I was going to ask you about that, is unusual in talk show world, because you seem to, when you hear a talk show, whether it's a conservative or a liberal, they're only talking to their own.
Yeah.
And why do you do this? Does this come from your dad?
Well, I think in some ways, first of all, I think it makes good radio. You know, people slow down for fistfights and car wrecks, conflict or conflicting ideas.
Yeah, but you don't scream at them.
No, I don't. But I mean, it's not gratuitous. It's genuine. And which leads to the second reason, which is that I think that when you have people disagreeing on issues and not calling each other idiots, but just disagreeing on issues, it highlights the issues. It makes them brighter. It makes them clearer. It helps people on both sides, frankly, to understand them better. So, you know, I'm trying to model for people how they can have a debate with their crazy brother-in-law over Thanksgiving dinner and not have it lead to a fist fight, or how they can talk to the guy who works next door to them.
But when did you depart from your father's thinking?
When I was 15 or 16 years old.
What was the moment? What was the reason?
You know, I think probably the anti-Vietnam War movement was what awakened me. I wasn't old enough to worry about the draft, but it was all around. And
was he for the war?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, still defended it until the day he died. You know.
Was he for Iraq?
Yeah. He thought George Bush was. He was a little uncomfortable with George Bush. My dad was more of a Eisenhower Republican than a neocon, but he was a Republican.
So age 15, and then what about the writing thing? When did you start to? When
We
was
were talking about writing. I started trying to write for publication when I was 12. When I left home when I was 16, I had 56 rejection slips on my wall. I had wallpapered my bedroom with rejection slips, and so I've been writing my whole life.
Well, when was the first time something was published in a real publication that meant something?
You know, I've never told anybody this. I probably shouldn't, but what the heck. It was when I was 16, and I wrote a short porn, and I was a virgin, and I wrote a short porn story for a men's magazine that they paid me $100 for.
And published.
Yeah, and under a pseudonym. And in
Have
fact,
you
I
ever
had
published that?
No, I don't even know where it is now because I used my friend Jerry's address to send it in, and when it came, they sent the tear sheet along with the check, and Jerry's dad opened it, and he thought it was just porn, and he tore it up and threw it away. And
what had led to you want? I mean, was it the writing or the porn magazine?
Well, it was actually a love story that just happened to have enough sex in it that it would satisfy that magazine. I've never written erotica since then, but
when did you find yourself
fascinated?
You've written
writing.
20 books, at least.
I've written about 30, but I have 20 books in print right now. Yeah.
And your first book was about what?
The first solely published book was about attention deficit disorder. In fact, it came out of the work that I was doing with Children's Village.
And your publisher now is, at least it has been over the last few years, Random House, in one way or the other.
Well, Random House, actually Viking Penguin published Threshold, my most recent book. Barrett Kohler has published several of my books. They're going to be reprinting Unequal Protection in May, which is the book about the Supreme Court. We're updating it to include the new decision.
Has this been good financially, this part of it, your life?
It's been okay. It's helped put 3 kids through college.
How old are the kids
I
now?
haven't gotten rich on it, but I've done okay.
How old are the kids now?
Our oldest is in her mid-30s, our middle child is 30, I think, and our youngest is 27.
Give us the radio station, the radio show part of this. You are, I know one of the things in Wikipedia, they say Hartmann's original article, Talking Back to Talk Radio, became part of the original business plan of Air America Radio.
That's right.
And we are in the shadow of the closing down of Air America Radio. I know you had left it, but what was it all about? How did you get into that part of it? And had you had a radio show before Air America?
Well, I started in campus radio actually in '67 in Brody Hall, as I recall.
At MSU?
Yeah, and then made a tape and got a job when I was 17 as a DJ at a local country western station. And back then you could put yourself through school with a part-time job. My wife put herself through college as a waitress at the Howard Johnson's, and I put myself through school to the extent that I did, $2.65 an hour as a DJ, and which is pretty good money back in '68. And I did that for a couple of years. I did news for 7 years, and I was program director for a while. Most of the news stuff ended up just being, I just did mornings, and then in the afternoons I'd go in and work with Terry, my partner in the ad agency.
Well, where were you right before you wrote this
Oh,
article
but back to
on
current
Air
day.
America?
Yeah, so I had 10 years in radio back in the 60s and 70s, so I understood the medium. And in 2002, Thanksgiving of 2002, Louise and I drove out to Lansing. We were living in Vermont. We drove back to Lansing to see our family. And all I could get all the way there was right-wing talk radio. And I'm a businessman, an entrepreneur, and I knew radio, and I thought, there's an opportunity here to not only do some good, but also to make a living. And so I wrote an op-ed called Talking Back to Talk Radio, and laying out how to, about the idea of formatic purity and how to do radio, how to do talk radio, basically. And Shelley Anita Drobny, who started Air America, read it and said, bingo, and called me up, and
Reddit just picked it up somewhere?
It was published in Common Dreams, and then it got picked up by, which is a website on, progressive website, and then a bunch of other ones picked it up, and it got around. And
called you and said what?
I'd like to talk to you. Can you come over to Chicago and let's kick around some ideas?
Where were you then?
In Vermont.
Doing what?
Well, at that time I was just writing and kind of retired from having sold the ad agency. But a few months after that, I thought, maybe I should put my money where my mouth is, try this out. And so we found a radio station in Burlington, Vermont that was willing to give me 2 hours on a Saturday morning after the tractor swap. Half our calls were, is that John Deere 301 still available? And
Give it to you.
Yeah, well, he'd let me do 2 hours on the radio. He said, "You can try liberal talk radio. Let's see what happens."
Just free. You just didn't,
Yeah.
nobody paid you.
I didn't pay for it. No, and they didn't pay me.
Did you have calls right away?
Yeah, actually, other than the tractor calls, yeah. And after 3 or 4 months of doing that, and we put together pretty good tape and got a show on a network. America Network at that time was owned by the UAW. This was before Air America had started. We were on 34 stations, as I recall, plus Sirius Satellite Radio.
Daily?
Yeah, I was on from noon to 3. I still am, 5 days a week. And that's how the show got started. It got started as a lark, as let's see if we can can I still do talk radio?
And the UAW owned the network?
Yeah, and they shut it down.
United Auto Workers?
Yeah. The previous president had been really enamored of the idea. And by the time they brought me on, the next president, he had died, the earlier guy, and the next president thought they really shouldn't be in the radio business. And so when Air America opened, they closed that network. And so I independently syndicated my own show for about a year, and then I signed a contract with Air America and ended up replacing Al Franken for a couple of years.
How hard is independently syndicating your own show?
You have to have a product that people want to carry. It's not. I bought some satellite time, and we just kept on producing the show and kept it on the satellite on the same place where it had been when IE had it.
Did you buy ads for your show and then give away, barter for the others, or how did you work it out financially?
We were running the same business model that is run in talk radio in general, which is that the radio stations have to carry 5 minutes of our advertising along with our show, and we sell that advertising time, and that's how we make a living. And then they have anywhere from 11 to 14 minutes in the hour that they can sell advertising, and that's how they make their money.
Were you selling the ads also?
Yeah. Chief cook and bottle washer, Louise and I. And we had one fellow working with us, and we sold the ads, and we produced the show, and I engineered the thing. I mean, I was a ham radio operator when I was a kid. I know electronics, and we got it up on the satellite. And when IE went down, we were able to keep most of the radio stations, and we kept our Sirius satellite clearance, and we're still on Sirius and XM.
Al Franken moved to Minneapolis, did the radio show for Air America out of there every day.
Oh, he did it from New York for a while, I think.
But he eventually moved there and then ran for the Senate, and he won.
That's right.
Did you then move from Vermont to Oregon to do your radio station, and eventually you're going to run?
No. I did move from Vermont to Oregon.
And why did you do that?
Well, it was a variety of reasons. One of our youngest daughter had moved out there a couple of years before we did. My mother-in-law moved out there, and my brother-in-law before we did. One of our other kids, she and her husband were going to move to the West Coast, and they could choose LA or Portland, and they were going to go to Portland.
Is it fair to say that Vermont and Oregon are the two most liberal states in the Union?
I don't think as a state they are, but I'd say Portland and Burlington, Montpelier are very liberal bastions. So, do
they think differently there than, say, when you used to live in Atlanta or used to live in Lansing?
Oh yeah, very differently. They're different cultures. And there was a book written 20 years ago, The Seven Nations of America, about the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, and how the different cultures and different language and different worldviews. It's really true.
When do you find that you are the most effective in communicating?
When I'm talking about something I really care about.
And do you speak?
Yeah, I do a lot of public speaking, yeah.
And would you rather do that or talk on that radio every day? I
enjoy both. I still get stage fright when I do public speaking. But it goes away after a few minutes. The bottom line for me is and this sounds really corny and dorky, but it really, if I can accomplish, I've incurred a lot of debts in my life. I've not been, and I think this is true of all of us. I'm not, I've not been the world's best human being. I've had many failings in many ways. And I also have a great debt to my parents for having brought me into this world and raised me well. and a great debt to the founders of this country who created a place where it was possible, and all the people who since then, and to people like Herr Mueller who have taught me so much. And I actually get pleasure from giving back. When I used to do relief work for Solemn in Germany, we went into Uganda in 1980 during the war when the Tanzanians threw Idi Amin out. And the Red Cross had just pulled out. The people were getting shot left and right. And we took over the Namala prison farm. We had 10,000 or more people dying of starvation. I mean, I had little kids die in my arms. It was really, really grim. And there was a guy there, there were about 5 of us who were not Ugandans who were there working. And one of them was from one of the Christian agencies in the United States. And one night we were all sitting around talking, and he gave this big speech about how he hated being there, but he knew that this was the thing that was going to get him into heaven. That when Jesus met him at the pearly gates, Jesus would say, okay, you did that. I know you hated it, but you did that. And came my turn to talk, kind of going around the circle. And I said, well, I'm here because I can't think of anything I'd rather do. Fun is the wrong word for being in the middle of a famine. But I've lived my life on the edge in so many ways, and that was just another edge. And we were doing something. And Herr Mueller always used to say to me, do something. Just what's the next thing? What are we going to do next? What are we going to do next? And so
People can listen to you if they can't get you on XM or Sirius or in a local community on the website.
Sure, ThomHartmann.com. However you spell it will get you there.
ThomHartmann.com. Last question. Why didn't Air America make it?
I think the biggest sin is that they were undercapitalized. Rupert Murdoch lost $100 million a year for 5 years on Fox News. So before Sean Hannity made his first dollar, they'd lost $500 million. The Washington Times has lost $1 billion for Reverend Moon. Air America lost probably $20 million in all those years. Their biggest sin was they were undercapitalized.
Thom Hartmann, thanks much for joining us.
Brian, thank you so much for having me.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
Up next, Prime Minister Gordon Brown at the British House of Commons. And then the Prime Minister takes questions from the Liaison Committee